Evidence that populations change over time, Part 2. DNA and protein sequence comparisons. The central dogma of biology, that DNA to RNA to protein leads to structure and function. You and your family members have similar body structures. Perhaps you have the same nose as one of your parents. Perhaps you have the same hair as one of your siblings. That makes sense. You share DNA inherited from your ancestors. If you saw these 4 people on the street, you would be able to tell that these children are related to the adults in the picture. They look alike and they share DNA. DNA and protein sequences all depend on a universal genetic code. All cells carry out transcription and translation to make proteins using the same system with exactly the same code. The process is the same in every living cell on Earth. One of the evidences used for evolution with common ancestry is that every living organism uses this same code. The universal code is shown on the next slide. So you can see the code of a 3-letter sequence of mRNA, which codes for a specific amino acid that is used to build proteins. The DNA of a lion is very similar to that of a tiger and less similar to that of a human, validating that lions and tigers are more closely related. All species share genes required to carry out basic cellular processes. By comparing these gene and protein sequences, we can gather evidence about how closely related one species is to another, or to others. Like anatomy comparisons, DNA and protein comparisons give evidence for descent with modification. Though anatomical comparisons are still widely used, DNA comparisons are counted as more precise when determining an organism's common ancestors. Mouse and fly versions of the same gene can be aligned and compared. A comparison of part of the mouse and fly genes' identical regions are highlighted. These gene sequences are 76.66% similar. The proteins corresponding to these regions are 100% similar. Cytochrome C is a protein involved in making ATP that is used by all species. That makes it a good choice to compare DNA sequences between species by examining the percentage differences of its amino acids. The chart indicates that humans are more closely related to chimpanzees and less related to garden snails. So you can see that for the cytochrome sequences, there are no amino acid differences between humans and chimpanzees, but a 29 amino acid difference or 28% difference between the human and garden snail. Over time, benign random mutations accumulate in each branch of the tree of life. Each species ends up with its own variation on an ancestor's gene. The chart indicates human and garden snails diverged from a common ancestor before humans diverged from chimpanzees on the tree of life. Eukaryotes' common ancestry. At the molecular level, there is evidence that shows the common ancestry of all eukaryotes. All eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles, for example, the mitochondria, ribosomes, and lysosomes. Their chromosomes are linear, unlike prokaryotes that have circular chromosomes, and genes contain introns that support the creation of different proteins from one gene. Animal embryo comparisons. Very early in development, when an animal is an embryo inside an egg or a uterus, the embryos of different species resemble one another. All animals share similar genetic programs that control early development, which is strong evidence that all animals share a common ancestor. As we grow and develop, other genes go to work and species' unique adaptations become more apparent. Human embryonic development. Early on in embryonic development, humans possess features that our evolutionary ancestors had. The older the embryo gets, the more it loses these ancient features because they develop into a more modern feature. Apoptosis, or programmed cell death, occurs within the webbing of the hand to allow for the development of fingers and toes. This also causes a tail to be reabsorbed and gill slits to become structures of our face and neck. On the left, a 48-day-old human hand that has the webbing, and on the right, the fetal hand after apoptosis, which removes some of that webbing to allow for the development of the fingers. Biogeography. Biogeography is the geographical distribution of species. It is generally assumed that similar species that develop closer to each other will be more likely to have a common ancestor. Darwin noted that the species on the Galapagos resembled the species on mainland South America more than species on other groups of islands. Because of this evidence, Darwin proposed that the Galapagos species must have come from a common ancestor of the species on the mainland of South America, or that the Galapagos varieties evolved from the mainland immigrants. The modern synthesis. Charles Darwin was virtually unaware of the details of inheritance worked out by Mendel. They never worked together. Mendel had discovered the key to how populations gained variety and could evolve. Darwin was never aware of this discovery. However, in the decades following their deaths, scientists continued their work, specifically to find an explanation for how populations evolved by natural selection. The new movement fusing the principles of Darwin and Mendel came to be known as the modern synthesis. Evidence and theory. There are many lines of evidence that support the idea that populations change over time, the theory of evolution. We've looked at 5 lines of evidence: fossils and their distribution, anatomy comparisons, DNA and protein sequence comparisons, animal embryo comparisons, and biogeography. Scientists also perform experiments to test the theory of evolution. No experiment has ever disproved natural selection, descent with modification, or the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution explains both the unity and diversity of life. The idea of descent with modification explains why all living things have so much in common. The idea of natural selection explains how our planet became filled with so many different types of life. Everything that we learn about living things makes sense in the context of evolution.